Therapy. I'm your host, Justin Berg with Purple Care, and today I've got John Tomlinson from Southern Charm Tree Care. John does a lot of our tree work for us. Very, very happy with him. And John, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
Very good. A lot of people have this idea what they think the term arborist means, but I think they don't really know what it entails. What, in your mind, what is an arborist? Define arborist to me.
Yeah, real generally, an arborist would be a tree doctor or a tree expert. It's a person who's gotten certified in their knowledge of trees. In order to get that certification, you have to have a certain amount of schooling or experience. The more education you have, the less experience is required to sit for the test. I'm a board certified master arborist, which is a higher level and more difficult to sit for, more difficult test to take. But once you've become an arborist, you have to maintain that certification with a certain number of continuing education units each year.
Yes.
So it's an ongoing education for arborists.
Very good. What is the main difference between an arborist and a master? Is it just schooling? Is it education? What is the main difference?
Well, it's mostly a knowledge base, whether you consider that experience or schooling, but it's knowledge base of just trees in general. To sit for the test, it's much more difficult, so you have to have a lot more years of experience in order to qualify to sit for it. The test itself is far more difficult to pass.
Sure.
So it is a more educated tree expert than an arborist. There's a few thousand arborists in the state of Texas. There's a few hundred master arborists in the state now.
So we've got one of the few 100, don't we?
Yeah.
I like hearing that. That makes me happy. So, how'd you get started in this line of work? Like, what's your story? Like, just tell me that journey you took to get where you're at right now.
Yeah, I went to school, Texas A&M, out of high school, and I studied horticulture. Got a bachelor's degree in horticulture. Had a professor that taught arboriculture, which is study of trees.
Okay.
And that professor was pretty influential on my direction of career choice after schooling. So from college, I left and worked for a national tree company for about 11 years. Mm-hmm. I left with them and worked for a local landscape company as the director of tree care for about a year and a half. And then I started my own business about 7 years ago. So it's been all trees the whole time. I think this is my 20th year of doing it. So,
very good.
Yeah.
Very good. What's some of the crazy things you've seen as an arborist? I'm curious, like, what are I'm sure you've been out there inspecting stuff. What are some of the more interesting things you've maybe run into when out there looking at trees?
Oh, the wildest stuff you see is usually the builders or the developers and what they've done to the trees, and then, how you'll get called in to try to save something that's been just completely destroyed. And the ways they destroy it are always interesting to me, just because it's usually from a place of ignorance. Obviously, they're not intentionally destroying the trees, but they're also not going out of their way to hire an arborist to consult before the damage is done, and they're trying to expect a miracle to save it after the damage is done. So I don't know if there's any specific examples, but yeah, construction stress is always one of the more interesting parts of my job. I do like getting involved in construction projects to preserve mature trees. Oftentimes I'm not involved as early as I'd like to be. Like I mentioned, if I had my choice, I'd be involved in the planning stages, because there's so much we can do to prevent the damage. There's very little we can do once the damage is done.
Sure.
So my hands are really tied if the damage has already occurred. But if we're still in the planning phases, we can plan around a tree a lot better than trying to save something that's just been completely roasted by the builder.
Yeah. Tell me some of those issues. Like, what are when it comes to planting a tree, like, what are some of those recommendations that you have, or what is the proper way to plant a tree versus what you're seeing out there?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of pointers I have on planting trees. So the number one thing that I see people do wrong is plant them too deep. And in reality, they're over digging the hole. So they're doing more work than they should.
Right.
And once they plop that tree down in the hole, it's too heavy a lot of times for them to pick back up, especially if it's a B&B tree, so the root ball is quite heavy.
Right.
So if they didn't measure where the root collar of the tree is, and the root collar is going to be really important part of the tree to understand, it's the flare at the base of the trunk that is where the trunk tissue transitions into the root tissue. And so the foot of a tree should look like the foot of a wine glass where it flares out. It should not look like a telephone pole going into the ground.
Right.
And a lot of trees, when they're planted, look like that telephone pole in the ground. So that tells me that they planted it too deep, or they've buried it after the fact with mulch or something. And excavating that root collar is critical. But if you planted it correctly, that would be above grade. And I even recommend planting about 10% of the height of the root ball above grade to account for settling, because trees will settle over time.
Right.
So you want to, you almost can't plant a tree too high. It's extremely easy to plant a tree too low. You could take a tree in a pot, set it on the ground. It's going to break out of that pot, root into the ground, and it'll survive.
Right.
But if you plant it just 6 inches too deep, it's dead. It's the number one reason trees don't survive planting.
Right. We see it all the time. We actually, it's interesting. We plant trees quite a bit, and we get called back. People saying, "Hey, you guys got to do a better job. We want you to come back here and plant this tree better." We show up, and the tree is, an inch or two above the ground, which root ball is.
That's good.
It's about perfect. And we are told that we didn't do our job right. And so we hear that quite a bit. And I'm like, we did. That's actually perfect. Now, do you recommend putting like that top, whatever, let's say there's 1 or 2 inches of that root ball sticking out of the ground. Do you typically cover that with mulch, like a light mulch, or do you want that dry as well?
No, I like to mulch it. There's been actually a professor out of Florida who's advocated for not mulching over the top of the root ball, which was kind of a controversial presentation at that conference. And his argument was that he's trying to encourage root development outside the root ball. He wants it to go out and look for water. Right. And that's true. That's important. The tree roots need to search for water. That's how they become drought tolerant. If they're stuck inside that original root ball for their whole life, they're not going to ever seek out that water. That's why bubblers are a problem.
Right.
Bubblers are good for like the first year of establishment,
Agreed.
but they need to be cut off so they can find the water on their own. And so his theory was that mulching over the root ball would encourage roots to stay put instead of surge. I still think that with our heat, that the amount of evaporation that mulch minimizes is important. So mulch works in a lot of positive ways. So it breaks down and becomes compost and organic matter, I should say, for the root system. It moderates soil temperatures. Mm-hmm. It also limits evaporation. So that's all good things. So to me, yes, mulch over it. Just don't build the mulch up onto the trunk. You want to thin it out as much as you can as you approach that trunk, and thicken it up on the ends, no more than about 2 or 3 inches depth. Yep. A lot of trees I see with too much mulch, that actually is detrimental, because 6 inches of mulch is enough to limit oxygen flow to the root system. So you want to not do that. So 2 to 3 inches of mulch. Once you get close to the trunk, an inch, half an inch is sufficient.
Yes, we're in agreement then. We're in agreement. As my father likes to say, everything in moderation, including moderation. But I think I see too many people just bury that tree or the root ball with 4 or 5. Or even mount it up. And I love when they do the volcano one. And I'm like, and I know that if you, maybe that's true up north. I'm not sure. Maybe if you're from Illinois or Michigan, or I don't know where, but maybe the tree, but you'll see trees, like all the trees just mounted up like that. Now down in Texas, I know that is no bueno. That's not good. I know that you can probably do it. You could do it to maybe a live oak, but just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. But most of the trees I've seen, plant them high. Do not do that with mulch. I don't agree with it at all, but it's weird. I still see it, even in Fort Worth. I still see
the volcano mulch.
It's interesting, and I see it from professional landscapers still doing. I thought it would be maybe the homeowner that did that for the aesthetics. Yeah. And it's actually and it's like I said, we've been called out to request that and say, hey, you didn't put enough mulch on the tree that we planted. I'm like, whoa, that's what we don't want. So
right. And I agree with you 100%. I don't think that's what you should be doing. If people are doing it, hopefully it's not because they think that's the right thing. They just haven't been trained properly.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting that there's so many misconceptions when it comes to trees and what the right thing to do. Right. What people want. It's crazy. Like staking trees. I'm very curious how you feel about this. I know that personally, I'm not a big fan of it, because I actually, unless it's a very windy area and it's going to fall over, but if I can get I'm okay with a little bit of movement if it's going to stay put. There are certain trees you got to stake, but I know that when you have, when you stake them and you have a little bit more, movement, you have more root activation, correct?
Right. Yes, and that's a great question, because there's a lot that on that. So when a tree moves in the wind, that movement that is happening within the trunk, even if it's minimal, is developing the strength of the trunk. That's how the trunks get that taper to them. Mm-hmm. And that taper is it's like a muscle that has to develop. So if you leave a tree stake on too long, and then you take it off 5 years down the road. Your stake should never be on more than a year.
Right.
If you take it off 5, 10 years down the road, like some people do, it'll be a floppy tree. It'll blow over, probably break at the trunk somewhere. So that trunk taper needs to develop, and that develops through movement. So when you do stake them, you want to stake them in a way that allows for movement. Ideally, if you can get away without staking them, you would do that. And so when you're selecting for trees to plant, you want something with the biggest root ball you can find for the size of the trunk, which means when you go to these nurseries and you find trees on sale, you need to really be cautious, because a lot of times what that is the nursery does not want to spend the money on the labor to up pot them. So you've got a 3-inch tree in a 25-gallon container when that should be in a 45 or a 65-gallon container. So if you've got the right size root ball with the tree that you're planting, it should be heavy enough. And then the way you plant it and the type of root ball, if it's a B&B, that's a very heavy root ball, a lot of dirt instead of compost. If it's a container, it's going to be a lighter root ball because the potting media is just lightweight. So depending on what you're planting, you might have to stake it. You might get away without staking it. It's really important when you do plant it to kind of slop it in. I really soak it in and get it, just to try to really adhere to the native soil as much as possible. So that way it'll hold itself up. We've done both. We've planted trees that did not need staking. We've planted trees that I've staked, and we've planted trees that I had to go back and stake later because they shifted.
Yeah, we're in the same boat. We typically try to explain to our customers, like, let's try not stake in the tree, not, and like I think they think we're maybe possibly trying to get away with not the cost, but it's not true. I actually want some movement in that tree, just like you said, to kind of expand that tree. Yet we do the same thing. I've noticed, like, if you're there's certain parts of Fort Worth where it just seems like the wind blows constantly.
Yeah.
In those areas, we've learned you better just stake them day one, because it's gonna be.
Yeah, we have some serious wind. So it's just when you stake them, you want to loose stake them. You want to have a slack stake line if you can, and it's better to use the guys that go all the way to the ground as opposed to the posts with the wire and all that. And if they're trees that, let's say you already have a tree in the ground that was a root-bound tree, so it was like a ball and socket joint shifting around, and you have to leave that stake on longer than you want to, at least annually move where the stakes are attached to the trunk.
Yeah.
So you're not wounding that trunk, and the tree's not growing over the whatever's wrapped around that trunk, because the water movement in a tree is just in the outer rings. So anything that constricts a tree works essentially like a tourniquet. So that's why when we do tree cabling or when we do staking, it's better to drill through as it is to wrap around. So we're wounding it, but we're wounding it less than pinching off water flow would do.
Sure. How do you feel about the anchoring system that you see, like, in so many cities require, like, it's actually the rules that you have to have an anchoring system below that tree when you're, and so I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
When you say anchoring system, you're talking about the duckbill anchors, or
there's a lot of different.
There's a lot of different types out there. There's a root ball stake that I think they're called tree staples, which are basically just inverse kind of rebar. Well, they're steel welded into the shape of a J, and you kind of hammer it into the ground, and the long end goes into the dirt, and the short end goes into the root ball, and that kind of stakes it to the ground.
Yep.
And those are permanent. They don't have to come out, which is nice about them.
Yep.
Those, I think, work well. But we don't do a lot of planting. So that's the reality of it, is I leave the planting to guys like you.
Right.
And I tend to focus on the other stuff. And it's just because we're not really set up with landscape install type crews and space to store material.
Right.
And it also allows me to send business your way, since you send business my way. It's a way to give and take with our relationships. So we've done a few plantings in the past, but it's really not something that we sell, and I oftentimes just refer it out.
Yep, well, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Give me a typical day for an arborist. You know, like when you're out there, I know you're going on different appointments, but give me kind of a typical day for an arborist.
Generally, we start the crew in the morning, so I'll meet the guys at the shop in the morning. We'll help them ready the trucks and give them their work orders for the day. Explain what they're going to be doing, and there are jobs I go out there with them to. There are jobs that are pretty straightforward that I don't have to. And I've got a production foreman that's been with me the whole time. So he's actually been with me the last 2 companies I worked at before this. So he's been with me for a long time. And he's a childhood friend. We're like brothers. We've known each other since we were 12.
All right.
So I trust him to do the right thing on these properties, and he does. So I don't have to start a lot of jobs having somebody like that working for me. But Yeah, so once we get the crew rolling, I either meet them at the job site or I don't. And then I've got my calls for the day that I go, and if there's, gaps in my day, I usually fill it by stopping in on customers that are in that same area. So if I'm over in Dallas for that day, I'll check on some of my Dallas customers and see how they're doing if I've got
Sure.
a gap. But I try to keep my day busy with property to property, just inspections, and a lot of those are called in. Just need a quote, or I need to know what's wrong with my tree.
Sure. When you're out there, is it a lot of diseased trees that you're looking at? I mean, is that something like, hey, there's something wrong with my tree, come look at? Is that call pretty common, I'm guessing?
Yeah, a very common call. And my calls usually fall into two categories. I've got the, hey, can I get a quote on this? And that's either pruning or removal, which is pretty, basic. I don't consider that a consultation. And then there's the consultations where, like, something's wrong with my magnolia tree, or I need to get your opinion on this tree that we're going to be building a pool next to. So those kind of things are more of a, if you're asking for my opinion and just need me to advise you on, I do charge consulting on those kind of calls. And I'd say I've got a pretty even mix of both.
Sure.
The consulting is probably what I'm more passionate about, just because it deals more with the plant health side of things. I mean, pruning and removals are necessary to keep the lights on, and we do a lot of that. It's mostly what we do. But the pest control and the insect control, just the plant health care stuff is what really kind of gets me excited, because then I feel like we're saving trees, and I'm in it for that. I feel like being a good steward of the trees is why I do it.
Correct. What's some of the main maybe diseases or complications you're seeing with trees when you're out there? I mean, what are you seeing mainly out there?
Yeah, disease-wise, your number one is going to be probably root rot. Phytophthora fungus in the soil. It's prevalent in heavy clay soils that are poorly drained, and most people have an irrigation system or overwatering. For just rule of thumb, it seems like the water restrictions I get excited about, because they're actually knocking people down. If they're following the rules, they're knocking them down to what they should be watering, which is no more than twice a week.
Agreed.
But so many people are either not under restriction or they don't follow the rule, and they're hitting them every other day, and then they don't know why they're declining. But it's important to understand that the root system of a tree needs oxygen just like it needs water.
Right.
And as humans do, we need oxygen and we also need water. But if you hold our head underwater, we're gone pretty quick. And the trees are the same way. Those roots need to breathe. They do a gas exchange with oxygen. That's why it's important not to build too much soil on top of them, because you're limiting gas exchange in the soil. If you're filling up all the pore space in the soil with water all the time, then you're going to suffocate them that way as well. So root rot's a big deal, and that's treatable with fungicides, but it's better to address the source of the problem and dial back the water. That's why I always get a little nervous when people put in new lawns, because the watering schedule on a new lawn is so intense that the trees are just, by the time I tell them, as soon as you can afford to dial that water off that lawn, you need to, because those trees are just dying.
Yeah.
So
I agree.
and then insect wise, the number one most deadly and common is wood borers, which are a type of bark beetle. They lay their eggs in the tree. The larvae are these little flat worms. They're usually flat. They can be round, but they eat the tissue that moves water within the tree. So they feed directly on the vascular tissue of the tree. So you can imagine how quickly they would wipe a tree out, knowing that the vascular tissue is just in those outer rings, and that cambium layer. That's where those insects feed. So we that's our number one treatment, is getting rid of those, and that's an important one to be aggressive with.
Yes, very good. I was very happy to hear you earlier say that you recommend that everybody should have their tree bubblers after about a year.
Yeah.
We tell them the same thing, and it's interesting how we have so many homeowners argue with this. Like, no, I don't want my tree to die. I'm like, the water it gets from your irrigation system in your yard is plenty. And like, no, I need something dedicated for that. I'm like, you don't. In Texas, you don't. Our trees are, for the most part, pretty drought tolerant. They're built for that. They're okay with it. I mean, your live oaks. I mean, I see live oaks, red oaks. I mean, I see a lot of our trees, even like cedar elms. You see them out in the woods with no irrigation system, and they're doing just great.
Yep. And that's another thing we kind of touched on, was the girdling. Anything wrapping around the trunk is going to constrict. And so if you have that bubbler right at the base of that tree, those roots, instead of going out radially like the spokes of a wheel, they're going to come back and start circling around that area. And what you'll end up with is what they call a girdling root, which is literally a root choking the tree itself out. So you're going to have girdling roots, especially if you have the tree planted too deep, because there's more soil for those roots to start girdling around in. But then if there's a bubbler and buried too deep, it's a very common issue. So root collar excavations, we're always looking for those kind of wrapping roots. And I think if you've got a regular irrigation system, meaning pop-ups or drip or whatever, non-bubbler, then you can probably depend on those as long as they cover the root ball of the tree when you plant it.
Right.
You don't always need to supplement with a bubbler.
Right. I completely agree. If you do see where there's that root girdling, excuse me, what do you do to fix that? How do you fix that situation?
Oh, you cut it off if it's not too large. If it is too large, you try to. Sometimes trees graft into it and they just go along with it, and it's not the end of the world. But anytime there's any foreign object like a wire basket that didn't get removed or synthetic twine that was holding the burlap sack on that didn't get cut off, I see that a lot on Japanese maples. For some reason, people drop Japanese maples in the ground and never cut that burlap off.
I don't understand it either.
Yeah, that's a good point to make, is that when you're planting a burlap wrap tree, you got to take the burlap off once you have it in the hole. The burlap's just keeping the root ball intact while you're moving it around. Once it's set in the hole before you backfill it, somebody should reach down there and roll back the burlap or cut it with a box cutter. You don't have to get the stuff at the bottom. I'm not worried about those because roots go out sideways. They're not trying to go down.
Right.
So I'm just worried about the lateral roots getting out of that burlap sack. And that burlap doesn't break down as fast as people think it does. And there's a very, very good synthetic burlap that you can't tell from natural burlap unless you put a lighter to it. Mm-hmm. So the synthetic will melt and the natural will burn. But even the natural burlap takes so many months to break down that why would you restrict a tree's first several months like that?
Right.
So taking off the basket or the burlap is important when you do that. And I forget what your original question was. I kind of got off topic.
I think I was asking the how to handle the girdling, like in other words, like how to fix that, which you answered. I mean, you've got to cut. I think a lot of times you got to cut it. Tell me more about the air spading that you do. What is that for?
Oh, yeah.
Let's talk about that, because I mean, by the way, we did a video of one of your guys air spading some of the roots.
Yeah.
And I cannot tell you how many people watched that video. It was crazy.
Yeah.
Which it was pretty interesting because he's just blowing dirt away. But tell me what that is. Tell me what it's for.
Sure. So the air spade uses compressed air. It's got a specialized gun on it. That's the air spade itself is the gun. There's another product called an air knife. So it's air spade is the trade name, and air knife is another one. But what they both do is they they destroy soil basically with compressed air, but it doesn't affect anything that's not soil, really. If it's rounded, like the roots or irrigation line or cable lines or wiring, whatever, they're going to be fine. So we can utilize it like a rototiller. In the situation I know which one you're talking about, that job, we were using it as a trencher.
Right.
So we were having to cut roots prior to concrete forms going in. So we used it to open up a trench and then hand cut roots. Mm-hmm. That's one way it could be utilized. Another way it could be utilized is to excavate the base of a buried tree without using a shovel, so we're not hitting it with a blade and damaging. My favorite and most common use for it is for alleviating soil compaction, especially on construction sites. So the compaction is one of the number one issues on a construction site to deal with. It's the soil can be packed as hard as concrete sometimes.
Right.
Once they're done with their construction practices, before the landscape goes in, I like to get in there with an air spade and till that soil around that tree. Based on the size of the tree determines how far out you go. But once you break it up, you can amend it with things like compost or fertilizer components, any kind of soil amendment that you would benefit the tree, and you can blend it in with that same tool. And I can effectively get down 10 or 12 inches deep with that, and I'm not cutting roots. So it basically works like a rototiller without blades. So doing bed prep for like a landscape, you could do that with an air spade just as well as a rototiller. And it's a very unique and useful tool. It's probably one of the best things we do for trees.
Yeah. I know that the job that you were talking about, we put in this gorgeous semicircle driveway and it had a stone border on it. It was a really, really cool project. But there was two massive live oaks. I mean, these live oaks, between the two of them, I would say had over 100-foot wingspan. I mean, just the two of them. And that's what I think you saw them, you were there.
They covered the whole yard.
So they did. Two trees covered the entire front yard, which is why they were putting a driveway, because the vegetation underneath wasn't doing too well.
Yeah.
Plus they needed more space. But so tell me about, I mean, a lot of people kind of get a little bit janky on that, where they're worried about cutting their tree roots and think we're going to kill a tree. Talk to me more about what you can do. So we put the driveway in, trees are still alive, they're working, but tell me what you did there specifically, and educate our audience on just what can we do to the tree roots to keep that tree alive.
Sure. Well, it starts with a consultation where we have to evaluate what you're going to be doing, what type of trees you're working around, because there's a big variance in the tolerance of the tree. Live oak is one of the toughest ones to as far as tolerating damage. So they're one that's going to be very forgiving for that kind of work. Red oak, which you would think is very related, is not. It's the opposite. So they're very root sensitive. You wouldn't have been able to pull that off with a red oak, even if we had done what we had done.
All right.
So you evaluate that. And then the age of the tree. So just like us, when we're younger, we bounce back quicker than when we're older. Younger trees are more tolerant to stress than older trees. So the age of the tree, the species of the tree is taken into consideration. And then we look at what they're going to be doing and determine how close they're going to be getting to the tree. And that's, the overall size of the tree determines what we call the critical root zone. And the critical root zone is a do not encroach upon area that we have to maintain for this tree to survive. And that's going to vary based on, are you affecting one side of the tree or two sides of the tree or three sides of the tree or four, So if you're just going down one side of the tree, you get a little closer than if you're hitting both sides of the tree because of just the percentage of root loss.
Right.
But the roots of a tree go, 2.5 times as far out as the drip line does. So the roots,
Really?
Yeah, they're well beyond the drip. A lot of people have a misconception about what a root system of a tree looks like. They think it looks like the inverse of the canopy. So it's not the canopy upside down underground. What it is a very shallow system that's extremely long and wide. So almost all of the roots are going to be in the upper 3 feet of soil, and all of the critical roots for uptake of water and nutrients are in the upper 8 inches of soil where their organic layer is. So down below 8 or 10 inches, there's just not a lot of organic matter for roots. Down there, the roots are just doing more of an anchoring type job. Further, closer to the surface, they're doing the actual work of bringing in food and bringing in water. But the common thought process is the tree root systems aren't that extensive, and they're shallow. They're much deeper and not nearly as wide, and that's not true. It's the other way around. They're very, very wide. That wine glass analogy I used earlier, think of a wine glass like on a dinner plate, and that's probably close to what the root system would look like underground. It's very shallow, very wide.
Interesting. I know that when we treat, we always stay just outside the drip line. And so now I'm starting to think, well, hey, that's maybe not quite wide enough, but I know a lot of times we try to treat, we do not want to go underneath that tree's canopy in any way. But
Treating with
if it depends on, fertilizers obviously aren't going to matter, but if there's any type of certain weed control, herbicides, you got to be careful. Now we use ones that are typically tree safe, but if there's a situation where this customer has a very bad weed issue, we have to use certain products. We always make sure we're outside the drip, the drip line.
Yeah, and herbicides, they require a special license for. I don't have that. I don't apply herbicides for a reason. I don't want to get into that. I don't want to ever have the wrong thing in the tank when we're fertilizing and the tree didn't do well. But herbicides are a tricky one because of that. What you described, usually most herbicides are targeting broadleaf plants, and a tree is a broadleaf plant.
Correct.
So they're going to maybe take a hit. Now, it's a very big broadleaf plant, so it's tough to kill them.
Right.
But you could certainly disfigure them with the herbicides. A lot of times herbicide injury is going to show up like contorted and curled up leaves on the tree. And then if you're putting down herbicides on a hot day, they can volatilize and turn into gas and actually kind of affect the canopy as well. There's, the most common herbicide, Roundup, has got to touch the surface of the leaf to actually affect the plant.
Contact
so
killer.
you're pretty safe to put that down around a tree if you're surgical with it, but you don't want to do it on a windy day, and you don't want to do it on a tree that's producing a bunch of root sprouts that are coming up from the ground, because if you accidentally spray one of those, then you might actually affect the tree as a whole because you just hit a leaf on that tree that was down low. So.
I've heard, I don't know if this is true or not, so I'm going to ask a question, but when you have this tree that's been there for 10, 15, 20 years, been there a while, and all of a sudden just one year you see all kinds of saplings, just a crazy amount of saplings, kind of all of a sudden. I've heard that means that tree is under stress or going to die, and this is his way of reproducing. I don't know if that's true or not, but I remember that was told to me by somebody. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, there's probably some truth to that. It's kind of an interesting thing. When a tree's kind of on its deathbed, so to speak, it'll take what little energy it's got left and put it into propagation, or self-propagation. So it's trying to continue the species. It's going to have the year before a tree dies, probably going to have the biggest crop of acorns or the biggest crop of pecans or whatever fruit it produces, because it's going to take its last-ditch effort to carry on the species. knowing that it's going to die. So it's pretty selfless act in the end. But root sprouts would be another way of kind of seeing that, doing that. Yeah, they're pretty. I think there's more to trees than we realize as far as their understanding of their surroundings and their environment and how they communicate with each other, which is pretty cool. So
I think it's very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, plants are smart. Plants
Yeah.
are smart. And I like how you talked about oxygen too, because we are constantly trying to get that across to people when it comes to even turf, like just turf, even though turf or grass, it's not as big as a tree. But it needs oxygen. It needs air. A lot of people, that's why we talk to people about aerating their lawns. I mean, you should be aerating your lawns, you should be aerating your trees, but I mean, they need air. And then when the soil is so compacted and we have these heavy red clays in Texas, it's just, you have to amend the soil. What's your thoughts on when you plant a tree of amending the soil around that tree? Are you a big believer of, hey, just put the natural soil back in place, or do you amend the soil?
No, I think amending depends how depleted it is, I guess, but most of ours are pretty depleted. You mentioned a forest scenario earlier versus urban. The biggest difference is going to be the soils. So the forest soils are not like our urban soils.
No.
So you do probably want to amend those, but I would try to homogenize whatever you're amending it with the native soil, so you don't create a barrier of this type A soil and type B soil. So you want to try to blend as much as you can. So when you're installing a new tree, backfilling the hole, which should be about twice the diameter of the root ball, which a lot of people don't do either.
No, they do not.
And that's understandable. It's a lot more work that goes into digging a hole 2 times as large as you need to drop the tree into. If you can't do that or don't want to do that, an alternative would be to literally take a rototiller, a blade tiller, and do that extra distance out with that. Because all you really want to do is affect that upper 8 inches of soil, and a rototiller could do that. So you could dig a hole the exact size root ball, take a rototiller and make a couple passes around that ring to loosen up that soil and amend that area that you rototilled and the root ball as you're backfilling it. And you would have more of a homogenized, blended soil, so the roots are easing their transition into the native soil.
I completely agree. Yeah, we actually usually use a 50-50 blend. We'll take like a really premium soil that we've got our own soil that we've developed that I'm in love with. But we take some of the same exact soil, we pull it out of the hole and put it right back in, and we kind of mix it. So that way there's an amendment, but it needs to get used to that native soil too, because there's a lot more of that than the amended soil.
Right.
It's going to eventually have to deal with it. So we tell our clients, we want it to kind of get used to that. That's what it's used to growing in anyway. And so we just amend it. But we used to do, I'll admit, we used to do, premium soil and amend the whole root ball and bring in this awesome soil. We thought we were doing the tree, doing it solid. And we realized over time, like, it's really not the best, because now when the tree gets to that hard red clay or gets the soil that's not amended, it's like, it's not as, it's not used to it. It doesn't know how to handle it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, we have 2 soil types really that we're always working with in our area. We've got the blackland prairie soil, which is that heavy, sticky black clay, can be gray sometimes.
Right.
Red is usually a higher iron. And then you've got your sandy cross timber soil, which is where you're going to see your post oak forest, which around here we have a lot of post oak. So
We do.
So we have and those cross timber soils tend to have striations that clay down deep. So the post oaks that can survive our droughts without any supplemental water is because they've found those clay layers where it's retaining water longer, because the water's not draining out of the clay. So when people who have post oaks in their yard are watering too often, which if you're watering at all, it's almost too often for a post oak, then what you're going to end up doing is saturating that clay layer, 4 or 5 feet down. And the post oaks are a unique root system. They actually do get that deep, whereas most trees wouldn't. The post oaks go down there so they can survive our droughts, because that's where the clay is. And the clay layer, once it gets saturated, water's not coming out of it. It's going to be there indefinitely. So you really don't want to get to that critical point where you start. Most times when I'm getting called on sick post oaks, they usually have beautiful St. Augustine lawns and great flower beds.
Right.
And it's because they've watered every other day to make that happen. And as a result, they've killed their tree. But if you were watering just for that tree and you didn't care about the other stuff, once a month.
Right.
Once a month.
Yeah.
So twice a week is already a big compromise toward the grass and toward the smaller landscape bedding plants. If you were just cared about the trees and you didn't have a lawn to maintain, and we weren't getting regular rains, rain counts, obviously. So if we got rain once a month, you're fine. But if you didn't, you'd need to supplement. So this last summer, we had, 90-something days without rain.
Yeah.
So then you should have watered a little bit. That's why we're seeing a lot of tree mortality.
Yeah. Yeah. I know that I was talking to a builder that was building right next to my neighborhood, and they wiped out. They just took, and I'm not saying you have to agree with this, but they took out every tree to build it. And I'm like, why did you do that? I mean, you had some really, really cool 30, 40 year. He goes, because they're mostly post oaks. He goes, and what's going to happen is we put in these, one, they don't like the construction. Two, we have to put in new yards, and when we put in the yards, these people are going to water. And three, that's what's going to happen is it's going to kill a lot of the trees in that yard anyway, the post oaks. And he goes, when we get calls and we complaints, it's just easier to literally start over and plant 2 new trees. He
Yeah.
goes, so, and I'm not saying it's the right theory. I'm not saying I agree with what he said, but that is what it's just, he goes, we don't get the complaints. We put in a tree that's going to make it, where the post oak, we're going to get a lot of complaints on.
Yeah, I can see the logic. I don't agree with it, but I can see the logic behind it if he's just trying to,
Yeah.
keep the wheels from squeaking.
That's pretty much what they're doing. So, and I won't mention the builder's name, but
Yeah.
I'd rather see some of them. I mean, I'd rather have a 40, 50-year-old tree in my yard
Yeah.
than a brand new 15-gallon, 30-gallon tree. I mean,
Yeah.
I like both. I would like to have both, but I'd like the mature trees, or
Sure.
I don't know. There's some trees out there that are 15, 70, and 100 years old that are absolutely gorgeous. And,
Yeah.
these trees are going to outlive us easily,
Yeah, taken care of. And the thing is, when you plant a new one, you don't really get to enjoy its fullness, and it's your next generation.
Correct.
Or third generation sometimes. But yeah, I mean, when you plant a tree, you're not usually planting it for yourself. So if you can preserve those trees, and you can absolutely preserve those trees.
Right.
It takes more work and more effort and more money, but it can be done. And I think it's worth it. They bring property value. They reduce cooling and heating costs on the home. And they just, a treed lot versus a non-treed lot is substantially different as far as real estate value goes. So if nothing else, see it as an investment in the property value, trying to preserve them. And so,
Yeah.
I get what he was saying. I don't agree with it, but I'm not a builder. I'm an arborist.
Yeah. And I'm not an arborist, but you and I are in the same boat on that one. Is that I get what he did, because I mean, it's economies. They're just trying to get up houses as fast as they can and sell them. And I get it, and they don't want to deal with the hassle. But
Yeah.
at what point, like, I know that we do a lot of things that cost me a lot of money, but I know they're environmentally sound. There's a lot of things I do that cost me more money that the public will
Right.
never see, but I know it's the right thing to do.
Right.
And so, and I know that, like just our fertilizers and stuff like that, I want something that's going to take carbon out of the air, throw it back in the soil, and make the earth a better place. And so we use the right fertilizers that cost me a lot more money. Yeah, it does. Is it the right thing to do? Yeah, 100%. And so when we have people comparing, say, us against, I don't know, one of the big brands out there.
Yeah.
Hey, why are you $5 or $10 more? We run up against that. I'm like, and I think when people when you, as an owner, I think you have a responsibility to try to do the right thing. And it eventually, I really do believe the truth will come out. Eventually, people are going to start seeing it. They're going to start asking for it. And you have to have that belief, right? And I think that's when it comes to taking care of your trees. Yeah, it's going to cost you maybe a little bit more up front to take care of these trees, or to kind of work around them. I mean, I'm sorry you can't put a bulldozer right inside there.
Yeah.
But the value will come back on, hey, you can sell this lot, or you can sell this home now, instead of $350,000, you can sell for $400,000. And
Yeah.
I wish they would think that way.
Yeah, and you're saved a tree. I mean, it's a good thing to do. I believe that we should be doing that, and I think that cutting costs isn't the name of the game. It's providing quality service and again, being a good steward of the landscape. And I think that's done through fertilizer is a great example, because gosh, there's thousands of different fertilizers out there, and you can spend as little or as much as you want on them, and they can be custom blended, so they're prescriptive to your site, or they could be just generic off the shelf, and they can be slow release where they last several months, or they can be all used up in a week. They could cause water issues if you got the wrong blend in there, and you get phosphorus in the water and eutrophication. So there's a lot to consider. So you definitely want to utilize a company that's going to take those things into consideration. If you don't feel like educating yourself on it, then at the very least work with people that have. So
Yeah.
I think that's important. Yeah.
We're on the same page there. Yeah. What are some of your favorite trees? Let's start with shade trees. Like, if you had to pick your top 3 shade trees that you just love in particular in North Texas here.
Yeah, so as an arborist, it's always right tree in the right place. So it's hard for me to answer this question. I've get asked this before. My favorite's probably post oak. I like them. They're kind of relics. Mm-hmm. They exist or they don't. You're not going to go to a nursery and buy post oaks. No, you have post oaks growing because you're in an area that has post oaks. So like cross timbers up here, or post oak savanna that runs kind of down the eastern side of the state, down to College Station. Those are going to be your areas where the post oaks exist. They're very slow growing. So when you have a big one, they're old. They're very old. They're 100, 200 years old sometimes. And to see them just get wasted and treated like they're disposable is aggravating. But it's probably one of my favorite trees. But you're not going to replace a post oak with a post oak. If you lose one, you're going to. I mean, if you have a little one that's already springing up on its own, that's fine. But you're going to not find them at nurseries. The closest you're going to get to that's maybe a bur oak, and that's a different tree.
Why don't you see them in nurseries? I honestly don't know that answer.
That just that unique root system I was describing. I think that has a lot to do with it because the roots are going to be deeper down. They're just the way they grow and where they grow. It's kind of unique considerations. They do like these sandier soils around our area, and I say you can't find them in nurseries. I've not found them in nurseries.
No, I've never seen one.
I don't, like I said, though, I don't do a lot of planting, so I could be completely, speaking out of turn here, but yeah, they're just, I tell people if you've got one, take care of it because it's not going to be something you can replace. I've got my favorite tree is right in front of my house. It's a beautiful post oak. And that's one of the reasons we bought a lot of post oaks on it. But yeah, they're just, like I said, they're native to our area. They're old and they're strong. They really do tolerate construction pretty well too because of that deeper root system. They can get away from some of that damage because they're lower down. The death occurs with the irrigation. So the years of overwatering usually is what does it. Or if they got really just aggressive and built the soil up too high around the tree or cut down into the roots real deep. It can be done during building, but usually it's done during irrigation. Another tree I really like a lot is bald cypress, and people have a love-hate with those.
They do.
I understand the hate side. It's the roots that stick up. They're referred to as knees. Yeah, there are varieties that supposedly don't do that as badly, like pond cypress or Montezuma cypress are supposed to be better varieties of bald cypress that don't. They're not a true cypress, which is why the word bald cypress is one word. Because it's not a true cypress tree. That's a good tree for a lot of reasons. It's a good tree because it grows very quickly. It gets very few pest or disease problems, none that are fatal. I mean, it gets mites, and that can make it look unattractive, but it's not. It's a cosmetic issue. If you don't care about having the perfect manicured lawn, they're an excellent tree. They're a great urban tree. If you're trying to see the trees like in downtown Fort Worth that are in tree wells, you'd want a bald cypress because they're going to tolerate the most restrictive root growth. You could plant them in standing water. They're the state tree of Louisiana. They grow in swamps. That's the swamp tree you see in movies and stuff. But yeah, I think they have a lot of benefit. That is a tree that you would plant and be able to enjoy its maturity in your lifespan. You plant that tree and 20 years down the road, you're sitting under the shade of that tree. Right. That's not something you could do with a lot of other ones.
It's interesting you said post oak. I will tell you, if you gave me 3 to maybe even 10 guesses what your favorite tree is, I wouldn't have picked post oak. It's really interesting. And after listening to you and then thinking about who you are and as an arborist, it makes total sense because it is a natural tree. It's a tree that, it's because we never get the request ever from somebody like, hey, can I get a couple of post oaks in my front yard? It's always red oak, live oak, Chinese pistache. Those are probably the 3 most popular. Bur oak occasionally. Those are, and then the lace bark elm. Those are your by far, as far as shade trees, those are our biggest request, I would say. And in fact, I don't know that I've ever fielded a call where somebody said, can I please get a post oak? In fact, it's true. A lot of people don't respect that tree and they don't like them. Like, it's just one of those, old garbage, scrub trees. It's a post oak. And I'm like, no, it's still it's an oak. I like all oaks. I mean, I think oak trees are good. They're just sturdy. Yeah. But I think it's really interesting. And after, your education, your background, and you would have more appreciation for that very tree where most people just do not.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they're taken for granted a lot.
They are.
But I think they have a beautiful form. They're very strong wooded. They're hardy as long as you're not, disturbing too much of around them. They're hardy trees. They can withstand our droughts, and we have some serious droughts.
We do.
They're good for cooking. If you're a barbecue guy, that's the number one Texas barbecue wood is post oak. So. I
have a stove at my house, and for heating, and so we, if we have a dead post oak or dead, and I will tell you stuff. It's just it's strong. It's good. I mean, if you were to build with it, I'm sure it'd be a good building wood. I'm not saying a lot of places are using it, but I mean, it's a strong wood. It's a good looking tree, I think, and it's great for burning. It's just an all around. Oaks in general are one of my favorites, just because they're their sturdiness. So they're slow growing in some cases, but they're sturdy nonetheless.
Yeah, oaks are pretty solid. Our biggest concern with oaks in our area is oak wilt.
Yes.
So
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about
sure,
what that is, how it gets spread.
man, this could be a podcast on its own.
It could be.
Yeah, it's a big topic. The post oaks don't get it, or they're resistant. I've never found a post oak with oak wilt. 20 years, I've never found a post oak containing oak wilt.
Pretty good data.
Forest Service lists them as resistant, so I guess technically they're resistant and not immune.
Right.
But so oaks fall into two categories: red oak and white oak. So all oaks are in those two families. A live oak is very unique because it's a hybrid of a red oak and a white oak. So red oaks are going to be the oaks that have the pin tips on the leaves, and the white oaks have the rounded lobed leaves. So a post oak's got rounded lobes, it's going to be a white oak. White oaks are very resistant to oak wilt. So that's going to be your bur oaks, post oaks, what else? Blackjack oak, things like that. Your red oaks, which around here are usually Shumard or Texas red, they're going to get oak wilt and die pretty quickly. Live oaks, which are kind of half and half. I'm sure it's not exactly half and half, genetic variances and whatnot, but
Right.
but they'll get oak wilt and they will die a little slower than a red oak will. And they're, you can treat for oak wilt. It's what oak wilt is, for people that don't know, is it's a fungus that colonizes the vascular tissue of the tree. So if you think of it like cholesterol, it's basically fungal colonies forming in the tissue that's moving water in the tree. So it restricts water flow to the canopy, hence wilt. And it only affects oaks, so elms are not going to get oak wilt,
Right.
anything like that. The primary way it's going to spread in our area is root grafting. So these root systems that go 2.5 times out the distance of the canopy are going to connect to other oak species and link up and graft. And then you've got fluid transfer, and therefore you've got disease transfer. And that's the way oak wilt generally spreads. There's also an insect that can spread the disease called a nitidulid beetle. It's not something you're going to really pay attention to if you saw it. It's just a little speck of a bug. You can look it up online if you want to see what it looks like, but it's not something that I can walk up to a tree and say, "Look at all these nitidulid beetles." I don't really see them, and I'm looking for them. I'm looking for evidence. But the way those little guys work is there's only a certain time of the year that they're active. That's the reason the people recommend painting wounds, is because those type of bugs will feed on the wounds, which is what's spreading the spore to the new wound. And a wound isn't just a pruning cut. A wound could be a broken limb or a rubbing limb. So any kind of wound is a wound. And the bug gets the spore from red oaks. Only red oaks will produce a fungal mat. And so this fungal mat is this little patch of fungus that grows under the bark of a red oak tree, usually on the trunk. And they put off kind of a rotting fruit smell, like a fermenting smell. And the insect likes that, goes and feeds on it. That fungal mat is covered in spore. They get rolling around in it, and they're covered in spore. And then they go feed on a wound of another tree, and they carry it over. So we try to time our pruning a bit around that. That's generally what the Forest Service recommends. Last I looked it up, they might have changed stuff, but last I saw it was Valentine's Day to the 4th of July. Excuse me. Valentine's Day to the 4th of July, they recommend not trimming your trees if you can help it. And that's live growth. You can take dead wood off because it's not going to have sap flow.
Right.
If you do have to trim them, then painting the cuts, and they say disinfecting the tools, although I don't buy into that as much, because if the bug has to find a fungal mat on a red oak to get the spore on it, I would have had to done the same thing with my tool. So unless I was cutting down infected red oaks with that tool and then trimming other trees with that tool, that would spread it. But just pruning one to pruning another shouldn't, in theory, spread that. I don't know if they've done research on that or not, but I don't see how that would work if you're just looking at the life cycle of the disease and the life cycle of the bug. It makes no sense for a tool to be able to spread it. So when you see these oak wilt outbreaks along lines where they've done like on-course trimmed a bunch of power lines,
Right.
a lot of times you'll have evidence of oak wilt following behind it, which is where I think they got that belief from that tools were doing it.
Right.
It's more so about the concentration of cuts attracting a vast number of those bugs.
Right.
So I don't think the tools are bringing it in. I think the bugs are bringing it in, and I think they're bringing it in because of the amount of cutting that takes place on a line clearance operation.
Yeah.
So they blame it on tools. So we disinfect isn't a big deal. You can still do it and be on the safe side, but reality is it's probably not necessary.
Yeah. So that's actually another big argument that I hear all the time, to paint or to cover up the wound or the scar, if you will. Like I know there's some people that, you trim all their branches and they expect you to paint all the wounds. I get, it depends on who you ask. I'm curious what your take on that is.
Yeah, yeah. This is a little bit of a tightrope I'm going to walk on this one.
It's okay.
Yeah,
That's what we're here.
paint your cuts if you
Yep.
can. Paint your
Okay.
cuts. It's not practical to expect every cut to get painted. It's going to be just human error that's going to miss a cut here and there. But if you can, paint them. But that being said, I guess the flip side of that we go off of sometimes is that, a wound on a tree, the cut on a tree suberizes. So if you think of like a cut potato, how it gets leathery after a few hours, about 4 to 8 hours, I think. A pruning cut is suberized enough to where a beetle isn't going to be attracted to feed on it and it's not producing sap anymore. So at that point, it's kind of naturally protected from anything without paint. Therefore, if you're not painting them immediately, let's say you forgot to paint one, a customer calls you back out. Well, it's not really, you come paint them just to make them happy, but the reality is the tree's already sealed itself.
Right.
Um,
My argument always is, do you see trees in nature lose limbs constantly, like another
Yeah.
tree, and then they don't get paint and they seem to make just
Yeah.
fine. So
I'm guilty of not painting cuts. It's time consuming. I'd have to charge considerably more if we were painting every cut.
no one wants to hear that, but
Yeah,
that's what we tell people too. Like we'll do it,
Yeah,
but it's going to cost you.
I'll do it in areas where it's especially if we're pruning in the wrong time of year, I'll definitely paint them. Especially in areas like our area, it's got a lot of oak wilt in it. Paint those. Yeah, and I feel like I shouldn't be admitting this on camera, but yeah, we don't paint every oak we prune.
We don't either. So no, I mean, and if people don't want to hire us for that reason, that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, though, if you want that, just ask us. We'll do it. I mean, we'll do it just like
Yeah.
you will. We'll do it, but I just haven't. Depends on the situation. Like, and it's kind of like if you have a branch rip and like literally tear that bark from like stem to stern, like just boom. There's an 8-foot wound. Again, you got to get on that thing immediately. I mean, for somebody to call us a week later and say, "Hey, don't you think you should spray this?" It's too late at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you could paint it for aesthetics.
Yeah.
And the paint you use doesn't have to be special. You can buy a $10 can of pruning paint or a $1 can of acrylic spray paint. It doesn't matter. It's a physical barrier.
Yeah.
So that's all you're doing is creating a wall for that bug not to be able to get to that tree.
Right.
It doesn't have to be made out of a certain type of tar or anything like that. So wound paint is not something you have to spend the money on. You could just use cheap paint.
Yep. What about as far as your ornamental trees? What are some of your favorites?
I like the redbuds a lot. I think they're beautiful for the 2 weeks that they bloom.
Yeah.
Even when they die, I still like them when they're just leafed out. The forest pansy redbud's really pretty because it keeps a purple leaf on it year round.
Yeah.
Or not year round, but the leaves are purple and it's got bloom, so you've got some
Right.
color in the landscape, more so than just the 2 weeks of blooming. I like saucer magnolia. I think they're really beautiful. They're one of the first signs of spring. Usually I'm driving around and everything's still gray and dead. And then all of a sudden there's a pop of color and it's going to be that saucer magnolia because it blooms before it puts on leaves and it's real pretty. We're trying to think what else. There's some good ornamentals we have in our area. I get a little tired of crepe myrtle. They're pretty overplanted.
Yeah. We use them in our designs. They're all right, but I will tell you the one trait I try to make all the time is the Vitex. I love that tree.
Oh yeah, it's a great one.
I love that tree. And I think they far outperform crepe myrtles. They're prettier. They outperform them. They're tougher.
Blooms are great.
Well, I've got one in my yard. It blooms 3 times a year. You do not get that out of a crepe. I mean, a crepe is bloom.
And they're good for bees, which are
Yeah.
I think some people think is a bad thing, but it's really we've got issues with the bees colonies collapse and stuff. So
Yeah.
the anything you can plant that encourages bees is good.
I don't know how intelligent you can talk about that, but I don't understand how people have not done the research or don't. But I mean, we get calls all the time as a pest control company. Hey, I've got bees. You got to come get rid of them. I'm like, you want bees? I mean, now if they're hornets, I understand.
Yeah,
If they're a
wasps,
wasp, I understand. But a lot of people see anything with wings with a stinger and it's immediately a bee. I'm like, the majority of the time it's a hornet or a wasp. That I understand you should get rid of. But the bees, I mean. And bees are actually fairly docile. I mean, they can be aggressive, but usually not. Like I've got a wax leaf ligustrum. I don't know why, but it attracts bees by the truckload. And I can literally go stand almost inside that thing, and like there's bees like just humming around me. Nothing. I won't get bit. And but I mean, yeah, we try to actually plant pollinators. We try to plant stuff to attract bees.
Yeah.
And but yeah, I don't know what your thoughts on that are, but I mean,
Yeah, I'm not that educated on it, but I do agree with everything you're saying. I love bees. I mean, the only ones you'd really have to worry about around here are the Africanized, which I don't really know how to tell them apart until you're actually in the
I don't
moment
either.
of getting
Yeah.
attacked. But yeah, I've never had an issue with bees, and I'm around them all the time as well. So I they kind of go about their business, and I go about mine. The only time I've ever been stung is when I accidentally injured or hurt one because I didn't see it.
Right.
If
Same.
I grabbed one by mistake because I was cutting a plant or something, then that's understandable.
Right.
But it's not. Yeah, I actually would like to get into keeping bees. It's kind of a hobby. I've not done that. It's one of
So
the
would I
things I'd
actually.
like
I
to
think it'd
try.
be really cool.
Yeah.
In fact, I started asking questions for a guy that does have them, and I said, "Do you actually have a?" And he goes, "Actually, he goes, a lot of bees are docile." He goes, "But it's actually genetics." I'm like, "What?" He goes, "It's genetics." He goes, "So if you have a hive that's aggressive, you euthanize it, and you just start over." And he goes and make it. And he goes, "But it's literally DNA." And I'm like, seriously? He goes, yeah. He goes, because I can have hives I can stand next to all day, never get stung. But if you've got one that comes after you, that's actually, you euthanize it and they just, kill them with the smoke. I'm guessing. And he goes, we just start over and bring another hive into there and we'll just, bring some more over there. And that's how it starts.
Yeah.
I thought it was pretty interesting. But yeah, I think I would love to actually get into that, some of our fields, and especially in the back here. I would like to bring in some bees. I love honey as well. So there's just so many great things about bees, but I like honey. I think it's healthy. Yeah, we need them. We need them
Yeah,
around.
I agree. And we've got a certain responsibility, you and I, because we're pesticide applicators, and it's hard to find a pesticide that's not going to kill bees too.
Correct.
So you want to, find people that are going to be conscious of that and know not when to spray, when not to spray, what to spray. The neonicotinoid pesticides are going to be, they've been in the news recently about being a big bee problem. And
Right.
so that category of pesticide is just one you have to watch out how you're treating and when you're treating. And yeah, you got to be educated before you start putting out chemical.
Right. If it's a true beehive, we try to relocate. More like
Yeah.
we really, there's a guy locally that we use that specializes. Like we could do it, but we're not experts at it. And so if I can find somebody that can do a better job of what I'm trying to do, then I bring him in and hire him, and I'll just hire him. But that's what he specializes, literally relocating beehives. And
Yeah.
it's kind of funny. Every once a year, he'll stop by and drop off some honey for us. But
That's cool.
it's very cool. And so we try to tell the client, like, you don't want us to kill this. Now, if the bees are in the house, like we had a client had bees all in their drywall of their house, which I was like, I've never seen that before. And that we had to get rid of. Obviously, those are bees that need to go by it because they're in the wall of the house.
Right.
But if they're in a tree, it's a hive. No, we try to relocate or tell the clients just deal with it. I mean, other than if you've got a phobia of it, I guess you got to get rid of them. You got to get rid of them. But
A lot of places will relocate. We try to do that too because to add to what you said, when they're in the tree, leave them alone unless you're removing the tree and you didn't know they were there.
Right.
Then it's a real fun day for the guys because they're going to have to basically bomb out of that tree as quickly as possible because they're taking a lot of hits. If they cut it's happened numerous times where we're cutting through a limb, no indication of bees, and we gut right through a hive. And when they come out with a vengeance. And so when we're suspended by a rope,
yeah,
and you got to come down quickly and safely, and you're just getting tore up,
Yep.
it's a big deal. So
run a chainsaw with a rope in a tree.
yeah, I hate it when that happens, and I look for them when I'm looking at removals. I try to pay attention to just insect activity. You can oftentimes wherever their entrance hole is, you can see them coming and going. So there's been a few times where I've spotted them ahead of time. There's been a couple times where I haven't, and they got us into some painful moments. But that doesn't villainize the insect. I mean, we cut
No,
right
it's
through
not
their
their fault.
home. Yeah,
We're attacking them.
Yeah,
I mean, we're attacking.
We started it kind of
you just-
unknowingly, but we started it.
Yeah, we just cut through the middle of their house. What would
Yeah.
you do? I always say, what would you do if somebody cut through the middle of your house?
Right. Yeah.
I would hope you defend yourself. But yeah, it was a cottonwood dead, called out, asked to remove it. And this thing, if you took 3 men holding hands, that's how many even 2 guys couldn't get their arms around. It was one of the largest cottonwoods I've ever seen.
Yeah, there are giants.
They're giants. And we were cutting through this thing. It took like a 3-foot bar to get through it. And we got all the way through that thing and we cut it up a little higher than normal because we had to anchor everything. And anyway, as soon as we cut through that, as soon as we did that, right through the middle of that, 3 baby raccoons just crawled out. Like they were just hanging out the whole. I mean, we cut just above them, and like they just came out and like came out and they were baby raccoons. They kind of like looked at us for a while, and it was kind of weird to see life. Like, we cut down this dead tree, and all of a sudden they just came out. None of them were wounded. We didn't kill any of them. It was pretty cool.
That's cool. Yeah.
But it was. I'm sure you've seen some crazy stuff like that.
Yeah, squirrels usually is the number one. Typically, if the squirrels that, we just set them at the base of the tree or a nearby tree, and their mom comes and gets them when we're out of the way. They'll be fine. And then you've got we've had bats. We found bats. One of the trees in my yard, actually, I was having our guys trim. They cut off a dead branch, and there was a little bat colony inside the tree. That was the only time it's ever happened.
Another animal, or that's not animals. Well,
Mammal. Yeah.
That's a good with all the mosquitoes and all the West Nile and all the disease. Bats eat a tremendous amount of mosquitoes.
Yeah,
they're not bad.
And
bats,
I need them at my house, so I was upset when we disturbed them.
Yeah, they're cool, and they're kind of a cool animal too. So the fact they sent off the radar. How many animals have? Imagine if you had radar. How cool would that be?
Yeah.
Or sonar, radar, whatever. I'm not a bad expert, but whatever it is. But John, this has been awesome. I hope people learned a lot about trees. You've been a great guest. And,
thanks for having me, man. Appreciate it.
Can't wait to. We'll have you again.
All right, sounds great. Thanks again.
Thank you.